Good day, and welcome to my Ranso's Weekly Wraps. I am Viv Govender, and as usual, we'll start with a general market segment and then end up with a tech segment. In our general market segment, we are looking at Trump again. I know we always talk about Trump each week and every week, but I think it's worth looking at what's happening with him at the moment. And we can't ignore him because he's so impactful in the world and he's moving so fast that every week there's some new news event that's going to be important. And in our tech segment, rather, we're going to look at Gemini, which is Google's AI system, and why a company that has advantages in many areas is simply unable to capture the zeitgeist or the hype around AI at the moment. Also, they did a big deal this week as well with regards to securities, and I want to talk about that as well. So let's start with Trump. This week, a couple of big news events around Trump. Firstly, we had a leak. What happened was one of his national security advisors basically invited a journalist onto a private chat where they were talking about things like, for instance, bombing, buildings and troop deployments and that kind of stuff. It wasn't the smartest thing to do, and there's been a bit of a backlash around that. I don't think it goes as far as some people out there are saying, but it does indicate something that we must keep in mind about the Trump administration. These people are not insiders in the companies or in the sectors or the institutions that they're dealing with. They don't follow the same rules as that have been developed over many years in these institutions. So like Cash Patel at the FBI, Peter Hegseth in defense, even Elon Musk in Doge, etc. These are people that have come into government but are not being part of government in a significant way, at least not the level that we are talking about right now. And they don't follow the same patterns, the same rules and regulations that has been developed by government agencies for many years. Now, in many ways, these regulations and rules are horrendous. There's an example for an interview with Ezra Klein and Jon Stewart, where Ezra Klein discusses a way in which government was trying to basically promote broadband, and how after 3 years, out of the 50 states that applied, only 3 states got approval to basically do this thing, or at least start towards doing this thing. So basically 3 years of wasted time. So regulations are sometimes bad, but they're also good. And one of the things that they're good about is they stop you from doing things like inviting just people from your phone onto a group chat, which involves, the vice president, the head of defense, to discuss, really sensitive matters. And not just, towards military sensitive matters, but also politically sensitive matters, because they also, denigrated places like Europe, talked about whether or not it was worth the US's effort to fight the Houthis, because it doesn't really affect US trade, and the Europeans are freeloading, and how much they despise the Europeans for freeloading. So this is an indication that, when it comes to Trump, we can't just assume that there's a plan. Sometimes there is just pure inexperience and incompetence that's involved here. Now, bring us to the next part, tariffs. Trump introduced 25% tariffs on vehicles, but 40% of US vehicles are basically imported. Now, a 25% tariff would make a big impact on this. Car makers can't afford to just absorb a 25% tariff. They will have to pass on some of this to their consumers. Trump has come out and said that he doesn't want any US producers to basically raise their prices based on these tariffs. But quite frankly, that's going to be very difficult in the marketplace. When you have a shortage, basically, either you have supply increase, which won't increase because, like I said, there's tariff, or you have demand drop, and the only way to get demand to drop is to increase prices. So that is going to be the situation that we're looking at here. We are going to be seeing these tariffs come into play probably reasonably soon, and that's going to have an impact on the market. Now, again, this is Trump, so we don't know for certain. By the time you listen to this, he may have cancelled it for whatever reason. But right now, it does look like this is going to play. And this is playing into a new thing I want to be discussing around Trump. What is the world's reaction to Trump? And this is what this particular segment is going to be about. So, the reaction to Trump has been, firstly, to consolidate kind of allied countries, ex the US, in a common goal. So we've seen, for instance, coordination between Europe and places like Canada to try and basically avoid. So Europe, the European Union and Canada are coming to an agreement to avoid Trump tariffs. We are seeing, politically, for instance, in Canada, there was a guy called Poilievre who was going to take over from Justin Trudeau because when Trudeau resigned, which was the Conservative Party was looking to be sweeping the election Right now, there is a significant improvement in their chances, and by most estimates, at best for the Conservatives, it's a toss-up, and in some cases, it's a clear lead for Trudeau's party, who was basically nominated a totally new individual, Mark Carney, who's, if your name sounds familiar, used to be head of the BOE, Bank of England. So he's like the central banker of England, kind of like Jerome Powell for England, or it was Lusaka Kanyaka for South Africa. And he basically just stepped into the leadership of Trudeau's party. And like I said, he's got either is dead even or he's got a slight edge over the opposition. And so it's quite possible he's going to be the leader of the Canadian government going forward. And what's important about this, he just had a speech where he said basically the relationship between the US and Canada, the whole relationship, it's over. It's no longer the case. He's going to forge a new pathway for Canada. We've seen Europe be not quite as aggressive, but there has been, like for instance, the new head of Germany, Vance, has come out and said that, he thinks that the US is indifferent to what happens in Europe, doesn't care. And so therefore Europe has to take care of itself. Now, something to note is I don't think they have the capacity to do that, quite frankly, at least in the short to medium term. If you look at the next 5 years or so, they don't have the ability to do this. The reason being is, quite frankly, that they've grown up, or they've developed their systems, Europe and Canada, under the assumption that the US was going to be the big brother to backstop their defense, to backstop their trade and a bunch of other things. And Trump is correct in some ways. These countries have not played fair with the US. They do have tariffs, maybe not explicit tariffs, but they do have ways to protect their local industry from US, dominance. So Canada has some pretty significant tariffs on US goods, and at least restrictions on trade in US goods. Even things like, for instance, banking services. It's very difficult for a large bank to play in the Canadian banking sector because of some of the rules they have around, ownership, etc. Same thing applies to Europe. The Europeans have, protected their own local, economies from the Americans for, a little while. So it must be noted that we are seeing, a reaction that's kind of in some ways fair. But it must also be noted that the US created the system, and did not create it totally altruistically. The US basically created a system in which they dominate the world's global military. Nobody else has a military that compares to the US. The people that are competing with them are the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, not the largest, economic bloc in the world, which is the EU. It makes no sense that a bloc as large as the EU doesn't have a pretty significant military force. Why? The US basically made sure that Europe doesn't have a military force because they have created NATO. They created a whole bunch of different, mechanisms to ensure that Europe kind of always stayed subordinate to the US. The same thing when it comes to the financial system. Yes, to a certain extent, the US is being taken advantage of. The US companies being taken advantage of by banking rules, etc., in Canada and other parts of the world. But the US dollar still dominates the world global economy, and there was that trade-off that they did. For instance, when J.D. Vance complains about protecting Europe from the Houthis, well, that is something the Americans do. The Americans are the global hegemon. They are the one country in the world that patrols everywhere in the world. The Canadians are not patrolling in Australia. The Chinese are not patrolling around Brazil. The US is patrolling everywhere. And as part of the privilege of patrolling everywhere, what they do is they provide security. So everywhere in the world, including the Chinese, including the Brazilians, including the Europeans, can depend on having their container ships full with expensive stuff travel around the world's oceans without any threat of piracy. And yes, you may say, okay, the US is kind of paying for that, it's protecting them, but as a benefit, it means that their US ships can go anywhere and basically, have an excuse to be a part of every single ocean in the world. There's that trade-off. And like I said, the system that the US has created was not totally altruistic. In fact, in many ways, it really benefited the US. I mean, look at not just military spending. Look at per capita GDP. The US is far wealthier than Canada or Europe is. Look at, for instance, technological innovation. It all happens in the US. Look at, soft power. There's a reason that you don't know who the best German musicians are, but you do know who the best US musicians are. And even because the UK, that soft power has diminished significantly. The US is basically, it dominates culture, it dominates military, it dominates the world's economy. And those things do come off not just as a one-sided thing. You have to give something back in a way to make sure that you have this kind of power. And the thing the US gives back has been things like, for instance, slightly unfair trade deals, slightly beneficial, things like, for instance, military, actions, etc. So keep that in mind. Now, if you could remove that, well, the other guys have basically spent decades. Then, in cases like the Germans, etc., you can't find a German that's been around long enough in politics that doesn't remember a time where they could rely entirely on the US for protection. Now they've got to readjust, and it's going to take some time to have that happen. It's not going to happen in a year or two. It's going to take a long time for it to happen, and they're going to readjust in a very painful way. They're going to have to spend money to readjust. They're going to have to take money away from things like welfare payments, from pensions, etc., and redirect that towards military, away from healthcare, away from their roads infrastructure, and redirect it towards the military. Now, the Europeans are famously, proud of the fact that they have healthcare, they have free education, they have all these social grants, etc. There's a reason they've been able to do that, even though they are actually poorer than the US. It's because they don't have to spend the money the US spends on the military. Now, if they are going to do that, well, it's going to hurt them. It's not going to be something they want to do. But at the end of the period, 5 to 10 years from now, you're going to have a military in the world backed by an economy that would rival what's happening in the US. An economy that's as powerful as the EU is will have a military that's extremely powerful if it wants to really invest in the military. And then the US is not going to have basically total hegemon over the global military world. Yes, it's going to be Europe, not China, that's going to be the thing up there. And you could argue that if the Chinese do rise further, having a European partner that's as strong or stronger than it is right now, as strong as the US, or maybe as closer to the US than it is right now, is going to be very useful. But it's not always going to be on the side of the US in everything that the US wants to do. And so that's the trade-off that's going to happen. The same thing with regards to tariffs. If you go out and put tariffs like this in place, it's going to hurt the European economies, it's going to hurt the Canadian economies, and it's obviously happening. But you cannot expect them not to coordinate around you after that. You cannot expect them not to make agreements between themselves, to insulate themselves from your economy after that. And so we are seeing a readjustment in the world, and we're seeing that happen in a way that's going to be, in the short term, possibly beneficial for the US, but in the longer term, it's going to have mixed results at the very least. Okay, now moving on to the tech segment. Google invented AI. The AI we use right now was invented by Google. Yes, OpenAI was the company that basically made it famous, etc., etc. But the technology was invented by Google. Anything outside LLMs, Google pretty much has an unimpeachable advantage. Things like, for instance, nobody else has an AlphaFold out there. Nobody else has a GNOME, AlphaFold being a computer system that allows you to develop new drugs. GNOME is a computer system that allows you to develop new materials. Nobody has something close to that. Google has spent the most money, has possibly the brightest minds involved, and has possibly the best AI tech in the world. And it released a new system this week called Gemini 2.5. And it is better than the other systems out there. And not just better by a small margin, it's better by a significant margin than anything else out there at the moment. And yet, if you look at AI news this week, it was not about Gemini. It was about Ghibli, a studio in Japan. For those that don't watch Ghibli movies, do so. It's like basically Disney, but better. Okay, excellent movies. A lot of the anime stuff that you see that you don't recognize where it comes from Studio Ghibli. One word of warning: do not watch Grave of the Fireflies unless you have a very, strong constitution. It's a very tough movie, but other stuff, go ahead, watch it what you want to watch. So it's a very well-known Japanese studio company, animation studio, and they have a certain style of animation. And this week, OpenAI let you basically take any photo you had and convert it into a Ghibli anime image. And so that was dominating AI news. Even Elon Musk, who's not an OpenAI person, put up some of these things out there. At the same time that Gemini 2.5 was released. So OpenAI was able to get the zeitgeist, the discourse around AI controlled, despite the fact that the best company out there released the best system that's ever been released. That just doesn't make sense. It's like, for instance, imagine somebody in the car industry releases the most efficient, best car ever, and then another company gets all the news about cars because they have a new paint color. You know, it doesn't quite make sense. But it has to do with the fact of how Google organizes itself. Google doesn't have the same commercial, instincts around anything else besides search and YouTube. Those areas Google has done very well. And to some extent, Android. Even Android is a free, system. It's giving it out for free to everybody else in the world. Everybody uses Android, but Google pays for it and doesn't get much of a kickback around it. Google doesn't have that same kind of mercenary instincts that other parts of the tech ecosystem have. In fact, they've been so successful. The Google search engine has been such a money printing machine that it's allowed the company to get very fat and very, complacent in terms of how it operates. And even though now it has a significant threat to the way its business operates, Gemini is operating in the AI space. AI is a definite threat to Google search engine. I personally use Grok and I use ChatGPT and even Gemini to basically do things that are more complicated than finding out, where location is or, a recent news article. If I really want to find out something, if I had a thing recently where I wanted to look at how many towns in the UK had a population of more than 1,000. Gemini did that for me, okay? Really easily, and, if I had Googled it, it would take me, several minutes to find an article that might have given me the information I needed if it was available in a single article. So that is something that is a real threat to Google's search engine business. But they're still operating as if that business is a monopoly that they basically can rely on forever. And they are hamstringing their AI division with things like safety, with things like, for instance, political correctness. In fact, the reason that the Ghibli stuff really took off wasn't so much that people couldn't do Ghibli stuff before. But the reality was what they really did was they removed some of the restrictions as to what kind of photos you could make into Ghibli animations. So people were able to take photos that, if you try that on Gemini or you try that on Grok, even sometimes, might have given you some restrictions. Gemini definitely would restrict you in terms of what you could and could not, Ghiblify, to use that verb. All they did was they used a technology that was already available and just removed some of the restrictions on it. Whereas Google basically put a technology that's better than anything else out there. And what do you think is easier to do? Remove restrictions or make something significantly better? And so, Google, again, misstepped, even though they released, like I said, the best model ever. Next, one final thing around Google. It may be that some parts of the company are taking note of what's happening out there, and they are making actions towards basically becoming more or having more of a stringent business model around the AI space. And to that effect, they basically purchased a company called Wiz, an Israeli security company that's been growing very, very fast. And I think security is going to be a huge part of what happens going forward. For those in my AI portfolio, you know that one of our best purchases has been a company called CrowdStrike. It's really done well for us. It's been less than a year since we got into it. I think less than 6 months almost since we got into it. And it's up, significantly from the point we purchased it. Well more than most of other parts of the portfolio. And the reason we bought into it was, one thing, it was cheap at the time, but also if you look forward and think that, AI is going to be a huge part of how we interact with the world. If you give a lot of information to our AI assistants or whatever, you're really going to need security around that there. Because you can hack into your email and have some information about you. You hack into your AI assistant and you're going to know more about you than you know about yourself. Okay, the hacker is going to know more about you than you know about yourself. And that is actually a true statement. Because the AI assistant is going to learn you like nothing else in the world has. And you need to know that that information is entirely secure before you basically are going to trust these things to do things like booking flights for you or organizing, speeches for your best friend's wedding and that kind of stuff. Okay, so that was the week in the stock market and AI. I look forward to speaking again next week, and have a good weekend. Cheers.